So, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by appreciating the initiative of Dr. Elias Opongo and Paul Beret to collect authors, to gather authors to write this book. I really appreciate that from the bottom of my heart. I also want to acknowledge all the authors that have contributed to the book we are launching today. Very important scholars, some of whom we have heard speaking. But everyone is making a big contribution to the development of African theology or theology everywhere. I'd like also to acknowledge the colleagues that I've worked with over the years in different institutions, in different places, for the help that they have given me, some, consciously, others unconsciously. But I want to acknowledge their contribution to my scholarship. But also the students that I have interacted with over the years. They've challenged me and to think over certain positions that I had. So their challenge has been a source of development in my own thinking. Also the readers of my work, some have critiqued what I've said, which is very good. So this is. They didn't choose the word nonsense, but they almost did it. But this is good and so on. But that has been a help. And those also who have appreciated what I have said. What I've been asked to talk about now is not really a keynote address. It's just a short presentation of how we should do African theology in the 21st century, doing African theology in the 21st century. First of all, I'd like to say that all the contributions in the book that we are launching are really showing us how to do African theology in the 21st century. The last speaker that spoke right now on the relationship between canon law and Africa and the African church. This is an initiative that you couldn't think about 10 years ago. You couldn't. Canon law was canon law and was applicable everywhere in the world. So, all of those people, we heard Professor Stan talking. I mean, these are initiatives pertaining to how to do theology in the 21st century. So mine will be, Dr. Elias will be just a short presentation, not a keynote address, on how to do African theology in the 21st century. Attempting to summarize the contents of the book we are launching today in one word, I'd simply say that it's all about method, or in several more words, how to do African theology today so as to construct a truly African Christianity and a truly African church. How do we go about this task that we are faced with? It is a task that has faced other churches throughout the world from the very beginning. How to be Christians, how to live like Christians in the first century, in Jerusalem and so on. So it's not a unique question to us. It's a question that has faced all Christian communities everywhere in the world, but it's now facing us because of historical circumstances and so on. Given a few more minutes to explain what this means concretely, I take a combined historical, sociological, and psycho-spiritual trajectory. I think anyone familiar with the modes or forms of the Christian church presence in Africa since the 19th century can easily understand what I'm talking about, and that includes most of us, I believe. The methods in question consist most significantly in anti-African mental, spiritual, and religious positions at a very profound anthropological level. The methods of evangelization in Africa consist in anti-African mental, spiritual, religious positions at a very profound anthropological level, whose consequences largely endure up to the present time, since the 19th century. Compared to the previous two phases of the encounter between Africa and Christianity, namely that of the early centuries of Christianity and the Christian church, the encounter between Christianity and the Christian church in the early century, that is from the 1st to about the 7th century, and then briefly during the 15th century, the legacy of this third encounter has been much more destructive of the African identity. In several ways, it can even be described as blasphemous, as being blasphemous. This is because the method concentrated on eliminating altogether African religiosity and spirituality as completely and absolutely antithetical to faith in Christ. But these are realities gifted by God, the Creator, to the people of Africa. Their spirituality and their religiosity are gifts given to the African people by God. We can find traces of God in those. So to eliminate them, to try to eliminate them completely, is blasphemous. We know there are deficiencies there in expression and so on, but that does not mean that we have the mandate to eliminate everything that is African. For a long time, no significant exceptions were made in this approach, and no meaningful discussion about it was allowed at the risk of excommunication. Mission, as is well known, amounted to a crusade against African spiritual religious values. Mission, that was mission. The mission of the church was a crusade against African spiritual religious values. So taken as the essence of Christian evangelization, this had three serious, long-lasting consequences. This crusade against African values had three long-lasting consequences. The first one was sociological. Sociologically, adherence to Christianity was tantamount to a denial of oneself as African. Denial of oneself as African, even in such, small things, but not so, as naming, for example. You cannot be baptized by your name, your ancestral name. That was pagan. You had to pick another, things like that, a denial of oneself. Methodologically, the second consequence was methodological. The path to Christianity involved more rote learning rather than understanding of the divine call and self-transformation. So you knew the catechism. Any one of you went through the catechism? If you knew all the questions in the catechism, who created you was the first question up to the very end. And so it was rote learning. It's not bad, but the meaning behind these questions and answers were not emphasized. The third consequence was practical. The Christian faith planted in Africa became largely superficial, a matter of convenience, necessitating what some theologians have described, even today, as dualism, or double religious consciousness. Dualism. That is, living as African, with African values on the one hand, and then as a Western Christian on the other. So people, and unfortunately, this depended on the balance sheet of benefits and losses. what benefits can I gain if I behaved in this way? Or what can I lose if I behaved in another way? So these were the three very serious consequences of the method of evangelization since the 19th century. All of these, in a real sense, acted against the true meaning of the mission and purpose of both the Christian gospel and the church itself, which is the affirmation of human dignity. The Christian gospel, the purpose of the Christian gospel and the church is to affirm human dignity, to affirm social identity, and to push forward comprehensive flourishing of the African person as a human being created, like everyone else, in the image and likeness of God. It's not perfect, it's not a perfect, there's no perfection, but this is the principle of humanity. This is a principle of being African. We are all created in the image and likeness of God. The imperative of a new theological method is apparent right here. The imperative, the necessity of a new theological method is seen right here. The task of African theology is once again how to change these aberrations against African humanity and to plant the authentic message of the Christian gospel in the continent. The authentic message of the Christian gospel is human dignity, social identity, and comprehensive flourishing of the human person. The obstacles against this method are enormous. You cannot underrate them, the obstacles. They include the existing internalized theological oppression of the African Christian by Western Christianity as part and parcel of the gospel message. We have internalized theological oppression because this oppression has been made part and parcel of African Christianity, of African Christianity, or for the African being a Christian, and this has been done by Western Christianity. And this has created a form of self-hate among many African Christians. We may not say so, perhaps we don't recognize that, but there is a form of self-hate brought about by the method of evangelization, missionary method of evangelization. So that is one obstacle, and in fact it is perhaps one of the most serious obstacles, that internalized theological, the acceptance of the internalized theological oppression. The second is the elevation of a type of alienating theological education, creating intellectual timidity. The attitude produces African theologians and church leaders who avoid asking and consequently tackling crucial questions relevant to the faith in Africa. There is a type of timidity in our theological education. I'm not saying that there has not been positive development in that, but it's not enough. It is a regrettable attitude that suggests that all issues of importance have been settled by Western theology, and all the answers have already been given by. So there are some schools, theological schools, where if you don't cite a Western theologian, that is your doom. You're doomed to I don't see, famous Western theologian here. So that is also a problem. And then there is the creation of a church leadership and structures that are theologically consumerist. I heard this word also used already. interpreting all different visions as disloyalty to the church. If you have a different vision, then you are disloyal. But we forget the history of Christianity from the very beginning, that there were different visions of how to be a Christian. And what saved the situation was dialogue. Of course, some people excommunicated and so on, but dialogue. There is certain theologians who are considering the contribution of heretics to the Christian faith. They did a lot of good to the Christian church. So 2 steps, my dear friends, are required as essential methodological approaches to doing theology in the 21st century. 2 steps. They consist in what I call via negativa and via positiva. The negation approach and the approach of affirmation. The negation approach and the approach of affirmation. The first consists in the comprehensive deconstruction of the negative perceptions and images of Africa by missionary Christianity. Deconstruction. As an African theologian has expressed it, we must destroy a church in order to build a church. We have to destroy a certain vision of church in order to build a true African church. In African theology today, and in the world church at large, through councils and synod and pastoral letters, significant steps have been achieved in the area of deconstruction, especially where Africa is concerned. You know, the synods, the African synods, even the Second Vatican Council itself, and the writings of many popes and theologians, there's been a lot that has been achieved in that area of deconstruction. The thing is, we have to be careful not to stop there. To deconstruct, we must be careful not to stop there. The even more important step on the journey of doing African theology in the 21st century consists in the move from retroaction or destruction to proaction or construction. From blame to positive initiative, inventiveness or creativity in all areas of life in the church. Must move from blame. That has helped us. I'm not condemning blame, but it's the first step. The second step is now to the move to positive construction, to inventiveness or creativity in all areas of Christian life, spirituality, canon law, as we have heard, interpretation of dogma, liturgy, and so on. Especially, again, the practical aspect of liturgy. What is the Spirit saying to the church in Africa? That's the question. In my opinion, unfortunately, not much has been achieved in answering this question. Not much. First steps have been made, but we have to continue asking ourselves, what is the Spirit of God saying to the church in Africa? And I think that Professor Stan, in his presentation, touched on that question. The Indian theologian Michael Malados articulates accurately how African theologians and theology must proceed in the creative endeavor to build an African theology in this century. He says, mission must be seen as God's good news proclaimed and realized by Jesus, entering into dialogue through the service of the church with the whole reality of the world and seeking to transform it in the power of the resurrection. Dialogue is central. To dialogue with the realities, with the faith of the Christian faith, the Christian church has to dialogue with the reality it meets. In the context, he continues, in the context of the freedom of God's Spirit, who is active among people in ways unknown to us, and the freedom of the people who respond to God, the way of mission is essentially dialogue. So dialogue in three things: dialogue for enculturation, dialogue for liberation, and dialogue for inter-religious exchange. Only in engaging in serious and respectful dialogue can we really construct a theology fit for the church in Africa in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Laurenti Magesa. Told Teresa just sent me a message that she's on, so I don't know whether she is. If not, we'll take a few questions to Prof. As we continue on and wait for Teresa to just settle in. She told me she thought it was 7 a.m., which is just a few minutes to 7 a.m. now. Okay, so any questions to Professor Laurenti Magesa? And if you want to link up your question also to previous speakers, that would be good. But for now, Professor Magesa's perspective to 21st century theology of deconstructing and constructing theology. The idea to keep checking on the chat in case somebody has raised their hand or
If there are no questions, it means nothing was understood, or everything, or everything was. Thank you, but that's fine.
Maybe I have one question for you.
Yes.
You've talked of deconstructing the via negativa there, deconstructing the African theology today. But my question is, as an experienced theologian, what are some of the hurdles you've experienced at two levels? One, in that process of deconstructing, because it brings understanding and misunderstanding. And then two is, how do you create new fields when the field is not ready? Because you risk facing a lot of resistance from the same when the field is not ready for you at that particular moment. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the most serious obstacles, and I would say is the most serious, is personal for theologians themselves, and that is fear, as I mentioned in fear. Fear to upset somebody, fear to upset the church, fear to be labeled as a heretic. That prevents a lot of people from doing what they know they should do in theology. So how do we remove that kind of fear? I think that for theologians today, the theological schools have a lot of responsibility to do that, to allow, ideas, the students to bring their own ideas, whether you like them or not, and so on. But if a person can articulate and defend their ideas, I think they should be allowed to do so. So the obstacle, what I see as one of the most serious, actually the most serious obstacle, is this personal feeling of fear. I'm not saying, if you're convinced, if this is part of your faith, convinced that saying something different is not right, then I respect that. But not just because you're afraid to upset someone, some authority. And then it goes to the second, that's the second aspect of, or the second aspect of the obstacles that we encounter in doing theology, that the leadership is not, and then that was alluded to also in our conversation already, that the leadership is not open to question, to working together, as the synod, the next synod is trying to do, working together. Are you ready as a pastor? Are you ready as a parish priest? Are you ready as a bishop to be questioned? Not in a disrespectful way, but to be questioned. So what you're doing, bishop, maybe could be done better this way. So, Father, those I think are two. One is psychological, the other is structural, but they are both, enforce each other. Okay.
Yeah, I see three hands, Anthony, and then we'll come to Jean-Luc and Alex at the back.
Professor Magesa, the question I'm interested in is the way in which perhaps even cultures have been influenced, have been colonized.
Raise your voice a bit, Tony.
Sorry. The question of the way in which cultures themselves have been colonized. So much so that in some places people think something that is a Western culture, that is their culture, is actually something that was imported. Do you think we also, for example, in different societies need to go through a kind of deconstruction of one's own culture as well as the Christian culture?
Definitely, definitely. My stand, my position is that you cannot do African theology, real African theology, without knowing African religion and African spirituality. The real, change in culture is important, but we have to analyze what is good change in culture. So, no, our cultures have been colonized a lot. Our cultures, and that's why, Christianity in the church just builds on that without critiquing, this foundation. No, nobody can deny. I think very few people can deny that African cultures have been colonized, and we need to deconstruct. So, to be progressive, where I come from, is to imbibe European culture. Then you are progressive. Then you are even education itself. This person is educated. He or she has rejected the African ways of doing things, and she has taken on Western ways of doing things. No, that's a very, very important point that must be taken very seriously, especially in our theological schools and in our philosophy in doing, African theology. So I agree with you.
We'll take the last two questions, then we invite Professor Hiza. Yes, Jean-Luc. We'll take them together.
Okay, sure.
Thank you very much, Magesa, for your presentation. My question will want to address at least two challenges. The first is ad intra. As we try to explore ways the African culture can help us shape an authentic African Christianity. How do you address what Ogbukalu calls villagization? So the tendency to project into the modern African church traditional mindset and structures, and by doing so maybe enhancing even things like clericalism and all the rest. And the second point is, how do you address globalization? Dr. Hekima just gave us some statistics, and as Africa is becoming the new center of Christianity, if we Africanize too much, will we not be repeating the same mistake the missionary did by westernizing us in the past?
Thank you. Alex, briefly, huh?
Yes. Well, I have just two questions, but the last one will go to Sister Laurenti. So just to begin with Professor Magesa. To quote him, he wrote in Faces of Jesus in Africa that there is always a problem of the question of monopolies of power by ecclesiastical oligarchies at the expense of the liberty of the people of God. And today he's telling us something about deconstruction. So I want to know, is it really much of the Western Church when it comes to bringing about our authentic theology as Africans, or it is rather a failure at the level of various episcopal conferences in Africa, since they are supposed in a way to bring about what I would call authentic inculcation, authentic Christianity that is basically contextual. And then the other question to Sister Awiti, she's suggesting something, what I would also call basically a kind of contextual canon law that would be kind of suitable for Africa. And I want to know from her maybe which kind of methodology did she use to reach at a conclusion, for instance, to say that we need to kind of relax roles on polygamy. Like, where did you get that from? Like, in terms of the research you did, do you have like the people you consulted, the married couples, or it is basically a desk research and you are trying to make some suggestions?
So Dr. Jean-Luc is talking about the dangers of villagization and globalization. These dangers will always be with us. Villagization is not only, it does not even concern, is not only concerned with churches, global churches. Even in our own African situation, that term applies. And that's the problem of tribalism. The problem, you think your mother is the best cook. So you are not ready to learn to eat. Even those people with dogs, try to eat a dog and you will see that it is really, So, the closed-mindedness is a danger not only to culture but also to the church. We have to be open-minded and learn from and that's the importance of dialogue, sincere dialogue. So you dialogue with someone else, you say, oh, no, this is. But I'm not saying this is easier said than done. You simplify that you think dialogue is easy. The dialogue is not, especially when it's structural. It's been structured in a culture and say, those people are like that, those people are like that. That's the problem in our countries, even in Kenya here, in politics, in everything. They are like that, they are like that. So we have to learn to analyze our own cultures and to, deconstruct, to take away the negative aspects of culture. Globalization. Globalization now is very, very strong, as I told Anthony. To be civilized is to be like a Westerner, where I come from, at least in my village, but I don't think that's limited only to my village. So it's a very strong, especially when, it includes politics, economics, and so on, becomes very, now I'm not saying we can solve it in one go immediately, but at least we have to continue thinking. As I said, it's an endless task to do that. Being human, living as a human being is an endless task as well, especially being a person of faith is an endless. You cannot say, now I have achieved it. No, you have to go on until you go down into the grave. So those are dangers that we have to be aware of. And Alex, you talked about what? Sorry. You asked me about what? I forget.
I was asking about whether it is a problem of really the West as such, or whether it is rather a problem of particular episcopal conferences to bring about it.
It's both. Again, it's a question of timidity, orthodoxy. So I remember was at a conference, Episcopal conference in Tanzania, where there was a question that was to be discussed. And Rome sent a message. Someone in Rome and said, you must not discuss that question. But it was on the agenda, and so on. And so, the meeting just overlooked that question. So it needs courage, a certain kind of courage. So not reckless courage, but courage in the interests of the church and theology in Africa. So it's both episcopal conferences, priests, theologians, and so on. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Magesa, for your... Sister Maren, if you want to respond to that question, before I invite Professor Hinga, I can see that she's there. I'll ask for your indulgence for 10-15 minutes as we wind with Professor Hinga, but welcome.
Okay, thank you. Okay, to respond to your question about whether my research had some methodology that led me to the conclusion that legislation on matters like polygamy can be relaxed, if I got you well. Okay, I want to begin by maybe making myself a little bit clearer that my point was, can the law of the church be more compassionate to those that find themselves in such kind of what the church calls irregular situations? I'm not in any way advocating that the faithful may begin marrying more than one wife. Then to answer your question, from canonical point of view, I would only select 3. The principle of, there are what we call categories of laws. They are merely ecclesiastical laws and divine positive laws. When they are merely ecclesiastical laws, the church can relax them. Merely ecclesiastical laws are not divinely positive laws that are immutable. They can be relaxed. So in such, talking from that context, it therefore means inculturating canon law in our context will call for, first of all, shifting what are the merely ecclesiastical laws that the church has power to relax. The second principle which we use is the principle of epikeia. Epikeia in canon law means the legislator, when he was legislating laws, his intention was for the good, that this law is for the good of the community, in such a way that this law is going to create harm to the community, it can be relaxed. And in definition of the harm, we will have a lot of criteria. What will we define this harm? For instance, during COVID, we were not able to go for Mass, and the legislator dispensed the faithful from that because it was going to be harmful for people to come together at the peak of the demand for social distancing. So epikeia is applied when necessity demands. Thirdly, the principle of canonical equity. That means the law can be very harsh if it is applied in its rigor in certain circumstances. So therefore, there are situations whereby the law can be relaxed so as to take care of a situation. For example, somebody being dismissed from the religious life when 2 days ago they got news that they had lost their mother. The superior would postpone communicating that decision, because if it is applied at that time, the circumstances can crush the person. So canonical equity demands that even though the law is to be applied, it has to be applied tempered with mercy. There has to be consideration of the circumstances, the situation, and the reality of the person. And all these can be applicable in relaxing canonical legislation in the church in the realities of the Africans. I hope I've responded to it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of our session today. We thank you for your patience. I know that the class is just about to begin. And we congratulate Professor Laurenti Magesa, who has really convened us here, and also our colleagues that presented today. I'd like to thank in a special way Reverend Dr. Montiamege Orobato, and then Dr. Kiama Mugambi. We also heard from Professor Stan Chuilo from Chicago, and also Maren Awiti Catholic University. I'd like to thank all the organizers of this particular event, especially the staff of CRPC led by Faith Canada, and also joined by Chen and others. I'd like to thank also Hekima University College, who've been able to provide us with the facilities that made this possible. Just a reminder that the books are available at half price only for today. And we have refreshments that are available there for you to be able to engage. But before we close, I'd like to invite Paulines Publications, sister, to say a word and also to close with a word of prayer before we.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure, on behalf of all the publication team, to honor Professor Magesa. Thank you very much. You have been really our author from time immemorial. And through this launching of the book, Africa Theology in 21st Century, A Call to Baraza. Publishing this book underlines the irrepressible role of African intellectuals and gifted theologians in the development of the new cultural identity and the language formation, as well as to form an African Christian culture. You have counteracted the saying that when an elder in Africa dies, he is buried with all his wisdom. That is, a library dies. You have become a leader of opinion, and our founder used to say that intellectuals fish with the net. And congratulations, Professor Magesa. To you, our distinguished professor and daughter, we say thank you for honoring the church in Africa. Professor Ahinga, she had said very well, so I will not add to it. And thank you also, Father Elias, for this partnership that through Hekima College we were able to publish together this book and the effort to document the theological legacy of Professor Magesa. Thank you to all of you who follow us in the Jesuit Zoom and Paulines Africa Facebook, and God bless you all. As Father has said, let us stand up and ask Him, make Him Mother, the one who gave forth the word, that He will continue to bless Professor Magesa in his Monos Docente. As we say, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Mary, Mother of the Church, pray for us. Mary, Mother of Africa, pray for us. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.